You're listening to Concentrates with Dr. T, a podcast discussing cannabis science, news, and hot topics. Hey everyone, welcome back to Concentrates with Dr. T. As you can see, I've changed up my formatting a little bit here. I've got a better camera, which hopefully it's doing a good job of capturing what I want it to capture without aiming at the wrong things or focusing on the wrong things. I'm still learning the new equipment, but I'm happy to be recording with a much better camera now and a much better microphone, so I hope those of you that have been listening in for a while now can hear the difference and can see the difference and appreciate the improvements that I am making right now. So that all being said, this will be the last kind of article review that I plan on doing for a while. So this episode's a blend of the old and the new formats, if you will. I've got my new equipment, hoping that makes a really good difference, a really big difference in your listening and viewing pleasure, but also that it makes it easier for the message I'm trying to convey to get across and just a more enjoyable experience overall. So I've been doing these article reviews and just taking some news and running through it and going in depth, and I'm going to do that again today. And moving forward, I'm going to be doing more content that's going to be organized a bit differently, and it's going to be more bite-sized. It's going to be put into digestible chunks, and it's going to be presented in a more organized fashion to give you some good information about topics that you've probably had questions about. And so to that end, please send me your questions. I'd be happy to answer questions that you have and to really dig into them and give solid information that's easy to access through this podcast. But today I do want to talk about a story that's been going around now for about a month. Once again, smoking marijuana is in the news for the possibility that it could raise your risk of lung disease. So as this NBC News title, one of the sensationalist titles indicates, smoking marijuana can raise risk of lung disease, chest scans indicate. In a new analysis of medical records, cannabis smokers had higher rates of certain type of emphysema than tobacco smokers. Wow, that sounds scary, doesn't it? God, who knew, that cannabis, after all these years and all these people using it, it was so dangerous, and nobody knew until now, until these chest scans. Wow, weird, huh? This article really is typical of a marijuana hit piece, one where they take a limited study that has questionable conclusions to begin with, and then just clickbait it, give it a grandiose kind of title, a scary title, make it sound like marijuana is so terrible. I'm going to get into the details in a minute. I've got the study they're referencing pulled up, and I'm going to explain to you exactly why it's complete bullshit. A lot of you that have been around for a while, you've seen these articles come up. You've seen these kinds of articles come up. There'll be a new scientific study that says that, marijuana is dangerous because blah, blah, blah. And there'll be this weird little study done somewhere, and it'll have very limited evidence. But you'll see the major news outlets take the little sketchy information they get from these small studies and blow it way out of proportion over and over again. When you see this kind of article come across that it's bullshit, but you don't necessarily know exactly how or why it's bullshit, I'm going to explain exactly how and why it's bullshit. But before we get into that, I just want to go over a quick overview of a couple different institutions' current look at marijuana's effects on lung health or marijuana's potential effects on cancer rates, and even the National Institute on Drug Abuse, even NIDA. As you read their article, they try their best to make it sound scary, but they always have to temper it with, but then this has never been proven out in large studies. And so what they'll talk about is the fact that when you burn, say, a cigarette, certain carcinogenic chemicals are produced. So we know that benzene and a bunch more carcinogenic chemicals are released when you burn anything, honestly. But when you burn cigarettes and inhale them, they're released, and then that's what's thought to then cause lung cancer caused by tobacco. It's been shown that these same chemicals are released when people burn marijuana cigarettes or joints or cannabis. When people burn that, it creates these same chemicals that are created by tobacco smoke or any smoke, quite frankly. So from that, people say because tobacco smoke makes these chemicals and causes lung cancer, then marijuana smoke, which makes these same chemicals, must also cause lung cancer. But that's not necessarily true at all. In many cases, that kind of logic is true. It can bear out, but it doesn't always, especially when you're talking about medical science, biological science. Things can get really nuanced and weird. So the actual current state of science indicates that there is no correlation between marijuana use and any kind of cancer. It's just, that's the current state of science. There's no good evidence that marijuana causes any kind of cancer, including lung cancer, even though it makes sense because it creates these carcinogens, because it's smoke. Okay, it just doesn't do it, according to the current literature. Now, there's not enough evidence to say one way or another. So if anybody says absolutely marijuana does not cause lung cancer, or whatever, nobody can say that, but nobody can say that marijuana absolutely causes cancer. Nobody can say anything. Anybody that's being honest will say that. But those of us with educations and experience and knowledge in these areas might come to different predictions about what we think will happen. I personally, based on all of my knowledge and experience, think that it will be shown that cannabis does not increase lung cancer, whether it's smoked or consumed in any form. I think this because ultimately there's a lot of differences between marijuana smoke and tobacco smoke. With tobacco smoke, people smoke pretty much consistently throughout the day. People who smoke marijuana might smoke daily, but it might be only one joint or a couple joints, morning and evening, or just the evening, or whatever. So there's different smoking habits, but also the constituents of cannabis, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, many of them have anti-inflammatory effects, particularly THC. Even though you may be causing some direct irritation to the lungs by smoking cannabis, you're also introducing an anti-inflammatory, THC and other anti-inflammatories, into your system at the same time. This could counteract the damage done by the smoke. That's one hypothesis on how cannabis doesn't cause the damage that you might expect. But anyway, as you go through NIDA's report here, they'll say things like smoking marijuana may also reduce the respiratory symptoms, immune response, increasing the likelihood of the person acquiring respiratory infections, including pneumonia. Animal and human studies have not found that marijuana increases risk for emphysema. And here's another example. However, while a few small uncontrolled studies have suggested that heavy regular marijuana smoking could increase risk for respiratory cancers, well-designed population studies have failed to find an increased risk of lung cancer associated with marijuana use. This is from NIDA's website. So they'll find little things like, oh, it causes this kind of damage. See, it has nitrosamines, vinyl chlorides, phenols, so you'd expect it to cause this kind of damage. But when you actually do the studies on humans in the real world, well designed, it never bears out. It just never appears. So some other things are going on. And so even though, yeah, it makes sense that in the test tube, it says these damaging things are created, so it's got to be damaging your lungs. It's got to cause lung cancer. No, it doesn't. And in fact, all the evidence points to the fact that it probably doesn't cause lung cancer or any kind of cancer. So I'm going to just breeze through these other sources. So Cancer Therapy Advisor also basically goes through the same story NIDA just did, where, oh, in the test tube, burning marijuana creates these carcinogenic compounds, so we think it causes cancer. oh, but wait, whenever we actually look at it in humans, it doesn't cause cancer, or we can't find any evidence that it does. So they go through that here at Cancer Therapy. WebMD essentially goes through the same thing, and also the American Lung Association with a heavy focus on lungs. They discourage use of smoking marijuana. I get it, they're being extra cautious, but even they won't try to create a story out of whole cloth to say that marijuana is more damaging than it actually is, or marijuana is more damaging than it actually appears. All right, let's move on to the actual study in question that NBC is freaking out over, that these chest scans are showing that you're worse off smoking marijuana than tobacco, which on its face we know is not true. Anybody that knows any number of tobacco smokers and any number of marijuana smokers knows that's not the case. But what the heck? What happened? Why is this study so far off base? I've got notes here, so I'll encourage you to go find the study on your own. It was published in Radiology on November 15th, 2022. Looks like Luke Murtha is the first author, and I don't see the institutional affiliations here, but that's okay. It was widely reported that this study was conducted in Canada. So what they claim is that they took 56... Okay, let me step back here. What this study did is, across Canada, they took chest CT scans that were already done. So these scans were in the system for people who had come in for some complaint or another. They were in the diagnosis process, whatever. These scans existed, and there was notes attached. So they never interviewed any patients beyond what was in the notes. So what they claim is that they took 56 chest scans from marijuana smokers. They took 57 scans from non-smoker control patients. And then they took 33 scans from tobacco-only smoker patients. And when they do a bunch of statistics from these three groups, they found that gynecomastia was more common in the marijuana smokers than in control patients and tobacco smokers. They found that the rates of these lung measures were higher in marijuana smokers than tobacco-only smokers. And emphysema rates were higher in age-matched marijuana smokers than in tobacco-only smokers, saying that 93% of these marijuana smokers had emphysema, whereas only 67% of tobacco-only smokers had emphysema. Wow, what's going on? I'll tell you exactly what's going on in just a moment. Let's get their conclusion. Airway inflammation and emphysema were more common in marijuana smokers than in non-smokers and tobacco-only smokers, although variable inter-observer agreement and concomitant cigarette smoking among marijuana smoking cohort limits our ability to draw strong conclusions. This is actually appalling to me, this conclusion. This is in the scientific article itself. This is their summary conclusion. And they admit here that there's at least some of the marijuana smokers also smoked tobacco. And so it's hard to really say what's going on there. That isn't even the half of the problems. So I've got handwritten notes this time. I'm a little old school. Hopefully this isn't too distracting. But here's what they actually did with the study. When they were searching the CT scans, when they were looking for the control group, they searched for the term, let's see, what was it? Okay, I'm going to highlight that. Okay, let me back it up. So please try to follow me here. They tried to pass the study as, we took non-smoking control group, a tobacco-only group, and a marijuana smoking group, and compared them, and the marijuana smokers were totally fucked up. They had worse emphysema, worse condition than the tobacco-only smokers. What did they actually measure? I'm going to skip over the marijuana smokers group for now and do the non-smoker control patients and tobacco-only smokers, and then come back to marijuana smokers so that you get the full picture. When they were trying to find the chest x-rays of the control group, they used the search phrase sarcoma initial staging in the Ottawa Hospital Picture Archiving and Communications System. So they were looking for people who were newly diagnosed with sarcoma and didn't have any history of smoking, lung disease, or chemotherapy, or any kind of marijuana or tobacco use. No history of marijuana or tobacco use. Initial stages of newly diagnosed sarcoma. Okay? If they were going through these scans and they found somebody that admitted to using any amount of marijuana, they could have had an edible one time. They could have smoked a joint in high school. They could smoke every day. They could smoke all day, every day. Nobody knows. Any amount of marijuana admitted to in the past, and they would push them over into the marijuana smokers group. Okay? They did essentially the same thing for the tobacco-only smokers group. They did the same search. They searched for sarcoma initial staging. So what they did was they found people with newly diagnosed sarcoma who were tobacco-only smokers and never admitted to any kind of marijuana use. If they smoked tobacco, had early-stage sarcoma, and admitted to any kind of marijuana use, even one time, whether that was a chocolate, 10 milligram chocolate a month ago, a joint 20 years ago, or I smoke every freaking day. Whatever it was, any admitted marijuana use went into the marijuana smokers group. Okay, now here is where it gets wild. The marijuana smokers group was chosen by searching for the terms marijuana and cannabis. They were searching simply for any evidence of use of any amount of marijuana or cannabis in the past in these patients with any disease, not limited to patients with newly diagnosed sarcoma without a history of smoking, lung disease, or chemotherapy. None of those criteria, just any evidence of marijuana or cannabis use, and there was a CT chest scan on file. That means they could be late-stage lung cancer, they could be late-stage any kind of cancer, they could be extremely unhealthy patients in any kind of condition, whereas the non-smoker control patients and tobacco-only smokers were selected from a very narrow group of people with newly diagnosed early-stage sarcoma. Probably a relatively healthy group of people compared to a lot of disease states and conditions and severities that we can talk about. So why would they do that? The answer is probably because there's not very many marijuana smokers, admitted marijuana smokers in the system. So they could only, by smoking marijuana and cannabis, they could only come up with these 56 CT scans. So they needed a roughly equal number of non-smoker control patients. So they limited it to a set of people that probably wouldn't have very much pathology in their lungs versus people who could have anything. And what's the second kicker? Here's the second kicker. This marijuana smokers group, 50 out of 56 of them were also tobacco smokers. So they make it sound like in the conclusion that there was some overlap, maybe half of them or whatever. 50 out of 56, as in the vast majority. So what you're really comparing here is your control group, which is patients with early stage sarcoma with no smoking or marijuana history or chemotherapy or lung disease, versus patients that are the same as those control patients with the early stage sarcoma, except for that they admit to having used tobacco. They have a use of tobacco history. And then versus the third group, which they call the marijuana smokers, but in reality, these are patients with any disease at any stage who admit to any amount of marijuana use in the past and are mostly tobacco smokers. That's what they're actually comparing. They're not comparing marijuana smokers with non-smoker control patients at all. The way that the article itself casts its conclusions tells me that the authors are probably anti-marijuana, anti-cannabis. And then they also gave enough fodder for the news agencies to really latch onto, because they can just quote the article saying this bullshit on top of adding their own layers of sensationalist bullshit. That's what I wanted to talk through, of why the particular article is bullshit. And it's always things like this, that when you dig into the article, you find out that there's something totally off about the way it's described, both by the authors of the original scientific article and the news media, as they just take the story and run with it. And now they have enough sound bites, if you will, from a scientific article to pull and say, oh my God, look, marijuana smokers have more emphysema than tobacco smokers. You dig into the article, do a little bit of critical thinking, and you find out it's not true at all. It is all bullshit. I should stop being disappointed by this kind of thing. I guess this is just par for the course this day and age, to do small studies, to do some sleight of hand to disguise what you're really measuring, label it marijuana smokers and non-smokers, but really you're measuring early stage sarcoma patients versus tobacco users with any disease. What? That is not a comparison at all. So it's hardly even worth mentioning the fact that Canada isn't even a very diverse country, and so if this was all done in Ottawa, the diversity of patients represented here is not very great. It's a small number of people, so there wouldn't be enough diversity anyway. So all of those issues remain, but I am especially astounded by how bold they are to make these groups, these control versus tobacco only versus marijuana smokers groups, the way they did, and then call them what they did, and then report on it the way they did. The news media, I get it. They always do shit like that. They're always trying to sensationalize things, get clicks, get money and attention at the very least, if not outright push false agendas for the government and other powers that be. But for scientists to put out garbage like this and in their own conclusions, what they wrote, without ever mentioning the fact that the truth is the marijuana smokers group is really a tobacco smokers group with any disease imaginable at any stage, versus a very narrow control group where they actually excluded lung disease, excluded chemotherapy, excluded history of smoking, of course, and tobacco and marijuana use. But it's crazy, honestly, how people are willing to do anything to get their scientific funding so that they can continue on in their careers, which I get the pressure, publish or perish. I get that you can only get your funding if you're asking questions that fit the agenda. And right now the agenda is marijuana is harmful still, and the government still wants to push that, even though we all know it's not true. They're still going to fund garbage studies like this that will give garbage conclusions that the media can blow out of proportion. And those of us in the know it's bullshit before we even dig into it, but it's still worth us digging into it and figuring out exactly which tactics they're using and how they're distorting reality to make it look like marijuana is more harmful than it is, or harmful when it's not. I'll leave it there. I want to thank you all for listening in. Once again, thank you for listening to this podcast up to this point. I've really enjoyed creating this for you. I want to continue to create great content moving forward. I hope you enjoy the new microphone and the new camera setup, and I hope you also look forward to seeing what I have coming soon. So I'm probably going to take a break for a week or two around the holidays here to take a step back, perfect my equipment setup, get a new format for this show, for Concentrates with Dr. T. Really get some good information, some content ready for you guys so that when I come back, it'll be looking good, sounding good, and it'll be some really great, concise content that will really enrich your own knowledge and hopefully inspire you to continue to push forward in your own career within cannabis. So thank you again for listening, and I will see you all next time. Thank you for listening to Concentrates with Dr. T. Please tune in next time and follow me on YouTube, Spotify, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Thanks again.